right, welcome back everyone to the latest episode of World Bigfoot Radio.
News of that area, the Anasazi and the Holocaust that happened to them, that Steve Quayle and all these, and Tom Horn and his group are talking about and holding this conference in Branson on the September 23rd. At any rate, that's going to be a good one, and I think they've got just a few spaces left. But they were brought in by a guy named Mahudi, who had worked with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He's in his 80s now and basically doesn't care. And he's blowing the whistle on the Smithsonian and a whole lot of stuff. He called, because these guys have done the work on the giants, he called them in and said that the elders of several tribes wanted to meet with them, and they met in Chaco Canyon. And, of course, you can see all this on their videos. But that they're shamans who, me having a background in Deliverance, I'm not really crazy about quoting them, but I can tell you this much. They truly believe they've been, number one, physically the giants are buried there, and nobody's known it. They showed them the areas where they were buried, and maybe even showed them the skeletons, I don't know. But they were convinced that they were there, and that they had contact with them, and that Chaco Canyon was a stargate. Now, I can tell you this. I got a friend who's got a friend, and my friend used to work for the government, and his buddy had done that kind of work too, and they were hunting up there, and the friend of my friend, who's a very credible fellow, said that he saw 3 bipedal raptor-type beings in Chaco Canyon walk up to a depression in a wall and disappear. Now, is Chaco Canyon somehow tied to Dulce? I don't know. But I can tell you this much. Those guys' word is pretty much gold. And there's some weird things going on there today, and those shamans all believe the giants are coming again, and that they tap into them in the spirit realm, and that they have said, we're coming back. So I believe that, by the way, Mahudi has worked all these years for representing the tribes. He was an employee of the Department of the Interior, Bureau of Indian Affairs, if I'm not mistaken, for sure the Department of the Interior, and he was their liaison to the Smithsonian. And basically has said, I don't care what happens. I'm 80 years old. I'm over 80, and I really don't care. I'm going to tell the truth. And so that's how all this happened. And there's some major funding behind these guys now, and they're holding this conference. And so a lot of these folks, I wouldn't be surprised if there's some of the folks that I've just mentioned are at the conference. So that was going to be a good one. I don't know that I'm going to be able to go. My friend has asked me to go and represent his media company there. We'll see. But however it works out, we're definitely going to buy the DVDs. And this should be a corker. Very interesting material. And but you know, the Catalina Island is where some of those have been found. The thought is that some of the other islands, the Channel Islands, up and down the coast, that they have. By the way, they're all closed off, like that part of the third of the Grand Canyon is. You can't go in there anymore. They're closed to the public. So there's something that we're not being told about our history. And it is as wild as what we've told you seems. I think Columbus, as we say at the farm, Columbus was sucking hind tit by at least 1,000 years. And I think that not only was North America known, but it's pretty much been proven at this point that the Chinese were in the Bay Area, and the Minoans were came down the St. Lawrence and were in the Great Lakes. And did we talk yet about the mines? So the Minoans, they didn't really know who they were. We'll talk about them. The Minoans, they didn't really know who they were. The Minoans, 6 years ago, they figured out, well, this is their stuff, and this is who they were, and this is their printed language. Now, they don't necessarily speak their printed language, but they've come to recognize it, and they've seen stone carvings that look like road maps on waterways in Europe, in the Middle East, around the Mediterranean, and somebody, the light bulb came on and said, oh, we've seen these same ones on the St. Lawrence Seaway and along the Great Lakes. And so now we go back and we look at the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and the fact that the geologists have said, now I may have covered this while ago, I'm having they showed them these mines, and the geologists said, these have already been mined, fellas, and it would have taken 10,000 men 1,000 years to mine these. So the Minoans were here. The copper from there has been tested, and they've checked most of the bronze weapons they found in Europe, and those weapons, 80% of what they found from the Bronze Age in Europe and the Middle East and Asia, the fingerprint goes back to the mines in the Great Lakes area. Now, the Minoans would have been there until probably the 1000 maybe BC, and in which case we're thinking they encountered giants and left, abandoned the mines. Now, if you look at your history books, the Bronze Age came to a close because suddenly they supposedly came up with the way to add carbon and create steel. But if you check your dates, there's a lag time of about 200 years. And so what were they doing in the meantime? Well, they'd lost their source of copper or bronze. And I think this had a direct impact on the way that history played out in Europe and the Middle East and Asia. And so we also see that the Chinese, now they had a fleet of 8 ships that could sail through, that could handle 3,000 men. And those 8 ships were part of an armada. And one of them, a replica, sits in a harbor in China right now. Again, the forensic geologist was checking out the walls that are on the hillsides above San Francisco and the Bay Area, and was told that those walls are very similar. Now, they've been rated for stone buildings since then, but at one time we know they were higher from history in the area. Nobody had a clue on the walls. He figured out that the Chinese had been there, and that the early parts of the Great Wall in China, in some of the frontier areas, look exactly like those walls. The Chinese would have been in the Bay Area. We see the ones that came in with the Egyptians on the Catalina Island area. And we see a situation where at some point, you're back, at some point the Egyptians, or let's say the Egyptian giants, from the Catalina and the other islands, and of course the coast of California, at some point they had an encounter with the Chinese. The only reason that anybody can figure that the Chinese left, because all of a sudden the Chinese abandoned everything they'd built, and they'd built all these defensive positions, and they just took off. So we're thinking that that kind of stunted the story. If you leave out the giants, you have to leave out the Minoans, you have to leave out the Chinese, you have to leave out all of the exploration and the conquest that had been done prior to that by both Asia and by Europe and the Middle East, that we know now was here. Mm-hmm. And not only that, but
well,
anyway,
the other thing I wanted to bring up was, you know, if you go with the Minoans or Atlanteans theory,
I believe they are.
They got an island continent, whether it's Antarctica or wherever it was out in the Atlantic somewhere. what are the chances that they built a super high civilization and had giants to mess around with them at the same time? It makes me wonder if they were on this island because there weren't any giants there and they wouldn't be messed with, or if they were actually in league with them and were getting technology from them. But either way, if they were the people that were coming over doing a lot of this copper mining, and interestingly, as I was mentioning to you a few days ago, they've found tempered copper weapons. And we don't know.
That blew me away.
Yeah, we don't know how to temper copper. We absolutely do not know how to do that. But somebody did know how to do it thousands of years ago, and they were making these weapons that were, as good as steel weapons out of copper. Well, why would you want to do that? Now, this sort of ties in with what Corey Good was saying, for anybody that's been paying attention to the latest stuff from Gaia, and him apparently having, according to his word anyway, been involved in the Secret Six program and a bunch of other stuff, and been down to Antarctica and all the stuff that's connected to that, and knowing a lot about the ancient giants and whatnot, that according to what he's been able to glean, for some reason, copper kills them. To use a copper slug on them, not copper dented, but copper slug, it'll do damage to them. Whereas if you use a little one or a steel weapon or something else, I don't know if they like heal super fast or what the deal is, but it doesn't seem like that has much effect on them. But if you're using a copper weapon on them, seems to kill them. Now, if the giants are all busy warring with each other and not being very friendly in general, and they know that the only way you can really kill another giant and get rid of them is to use copper weapons, it'd be pretty popular to have copper weapons all over the place, not only for the giants, but for the humans that had to deal with it too. They may have picked this trick up. Now, you were telling me, what were the numbers on how long the whole region around the Great Lakes has been mined out? There were, huge copper mines there.
Yeah, 10,000.
The Native Americans were.
10,000 men, 1,000 years just to do the mines in the Upper Peninsula.
Just Upper Penn, Michigan would take 10,000 men, 1,000 years to dig that much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so
I went through that story while you were gone.
Really, really good reason for them to want to extract all that copper in order to put that kind of effort into it.
Not counting the mines in Minnesota and the rest of the Great Lakes.
Yeah. And I should also point out that one of the biggest areas on the entire Earth, and where a lot of it World War II came from, for the Iron Range, northern Minnesota.
Right.
And the Mesabi Range. Mesabi, by the way, Chippewa word, which means giant.
Yep.
They even called it the Giant Range. Now, if they were that advanced, they could figure out how to make tempered copper weapons. You'd think that they would have known how to make iron weapons and temper them, but they weren't for some reason. So why? And they've got the biggest supplies on Earth of iron sitting there right there, and they're not using it. They're digging way the hell underground and pulling out copper for some reason.
Well, they hadn't figured out steel yet either, though.
Yeah, well, but no. Iron goes back a long, long ways, and it goes well into the period we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And they maybe hadn't figured out how to temper steel yet, but they've somehow figured out how to temper and make copper weapons that we don't even know how to do.
Right.
So
when you were away, I went into the end of the Bronze Age because they were cut off from the copper in the Upper Great Lakes because of the giants, the Minoans, and how there was a lag. Historians try to say, well, it was, they discovered steel. Yeah, but that was like 200 years later. So there was a lag time when and I personally believe that had they had copper, Europe would have looked. If copper for the bronze, Europe wouldn't have. There was a lack of weapons for an extended period of time, and that's been noted in history.
Yeah, which is very interesting. It's like all of a sudden their supply dried up. Where was it coming from to start with, and where did it stop coming from? Right. And they've gotten examples of it in Europe that they tested and went, hey, this is the same copper that came off those mines over there by the Great Lakes. How the hell did it get over here to Europe?
80%.
Yeah.
In excess of 80%.
Yeah.
This is all stuff that's come out literally in the last decade. The Minoans, they didn't know who they were until about 6 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
They just figured it out. Another interesting piece was, they didn't believe in Noah's flood. And everybody's from the Christian side that has been looking into these issues has said there had to have been an asteroid strike to create the Gulf of Mexico,
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Chicxulub.
Within the last two, pardon me?
Chicxulub crater, that's the one they talked
Yeah.
about that supposedly killed the dinosaurs.
Well,
Yucatan.
right. For the Gulf of Mexico is 1,100 miles across.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would have meant an asteroid 110 miles wide,
Mm-hmm.
1/10. And the thing that the scientists have always argued is it would have left burn marks everywhere.
Yeah.
Well, not if the Earth was covered in water.
Nope.
And what's kind of been amazing to see unfold is in the last 2 years they've gotten some deep, what do they call them, remotely operated subs. And they've got some initials for that. I can't remember. Anyway,
it's remote operated vehicle.
There you go. And they have found a Yucatan city sitting off the coast of Cuba, the northern coast of Cuba, in 300 foot of water.
No, Dave, that's in 2,000 feet of water.
Oh,
if it was in 300 feet of water, they could say, oh, well, that's just because of the difference in the water levels.
Yeah, well, I'm mistaken.
No, it's in 2,000 feet of water. The reason I know that is because I was living in Florida when the first report came out, and the people that were doing this were not connected to the government and actually contacted the military and went, hey, do you guys have like some secret base here or something we shouldn't be talking about? Because we got ROV footage of like buildings on the bottom of the ocean, 2,000 feet of water off the coast of Cuba. Mm-hmm. And they went, nope, we got nothing down there. And they went, okay, well, we're gonna send another team back and do some recon. And it doesn't look like they ever ended up doing that for some bizarre reason. But meanwhile, we've got this, pretty good footage or pictures of it looks like a big, pyramid setup that they'd have sitting on land in Yucatan, Central America somewhere.
And so the theory is that I did have my depth wrong. You
had your right.
Yeah, my facts are that Cuba and that area at one time was connected to the Yucatan.
Yeah.
And that this has pretty much proven the flood theory, folks. There's
another theory that I should mention at this point before I let you go any further. Sorry for butting in here, Dave, but there actually looks like Cuba was a lot bigger, and there was a whole archipelago of islands that were on both sides of it, sort of all like a little mini island empire, which may have been part of what they were calling Atlantis. And after this big disaster happened, most of Cuba blew underwater, which puts that temple complex 2 feet underwater, and a bunch of the little outlying islands just gone.
Mm-hmm. Well,
and you end up things with like the Bimini Road and stuff down on the bottom of the Caribbean.
Right. I also found it interesting that they started checking the DNA of Earth, pursuing the Pangea theory of one continent at one time. The continents being one supercontinent.
Right.
And when they checked the DNA in Texas, you'll never guess where the DNA they found that matched it.
Where?
Antarctica.
God.
So, folks, there's been a pole shift in our past that really did shake the Earth's crust loose and flipped us around.
Mm-hmm.
Is Planet X real? Yes. Is it coming tomorrow? Nah. Is it coming? Well, you look at the sixth seal, and it sure resembles that.
Yeah. Yeah, this is the winged disc.
There's a lot of things that a lot of folks have thought for years that are gelling. With my background in biblical history, and then also in deliverance and some other subjects, I want to say right now that while it's interesting to see what Gaia has come up with, I in no way, in any way, shape, or form, am a part or think the way they do on the extraterrestrials being friendly and the hollow earth and the whole 9 yards. That's not anything that I'm involved in. I like to listen to folks occasionally, but there's some things that I draw a line on, and that's part of it. And I'm hoping Duke will join us again here shortly. He's using a cell phone. I'm hoping his battery didn't run dead. But this is not the first solo show I've done. I just like to have a little preparation. But I think it's incumbent upon us, if we really want to understand the background of the Bigfoot material, that we understand the giants and that the cryptids. We've got these creatures that nobody can figure out, and everybody that there's a whole school of thought that says, well, these things are a remnant hominid and et cetera, but none of them want to mention the giants. And there's an 800-pound gorilla in the room, figuratively speaking, and that is that there's been a whole lot of these things, a whole lot more. As many Bigfoot as there are, and as many cryptids as there are, there's been more giant skeletons recovered than there are cryptids. And it just seems to a lot of us that there ought to be a connection between these two. And that while it seems that the giants in North America, at least, and in Europe, died out in the 1500s, I think they'd been killed off a lot earlier than that in Europe. We suddenly see, if you hear the history, the actual history, and not the folks that are offended and saying we've been here thousands of years, but if you're listening to the elders and the actual history of the tribes, they were all in Canada and did come over the land bridge, and the humans, and didn't come into what is the lower 48 states until a lot of the tribes that we know today, they didn't come down. Their history is they didn't come down until the 1500s because there were giants in the land. And about the year 1500 is when their history in the lower 48 United States began. The Apaches started out in Minnesota. And eventually, the area where I'm at in Oklahoma, most of Texas, and down to maybe the north half of Texas, and New Mexico, Colorado was called Apacheria. And it was a no-go area. And within about 100 years, the Comanche had come down with the Kiowa working with them, pushed the Apaches out, and this became known as Comancheria. And if you've seen the movies The Lonesome Dove, etc., there's talk about Comancheria. And if you look into the Goodnight Loving Cattle Drive, the course they had to take to avoid Comancheria to bring cattle into Colorado and upper New Mexico. The Comancheria was real and was huge, and it was a no-go area. The tribes, I believe the Nez Perce, the Nez Perce, and the Blackfoot came down from Canada on each side of the Sierras, or actually up there, the dividing of the ranges. And the Sioux, they came through Minnesota. The Mandan, I believe, came straight down from Saskatoon in that area, the plains. And a lot of the tribes on the East Coast came down through Canada. The Iroquois Confederacy, the Muskegans, all of them, Muskogeans, of which I am, my heritage is, part of my heritage, is they came down, I believe, on the eastern part of Canada. It's interesting to hear the history of where all these tribes came from, the time they came down, and the things that happened before. Especially living in Arizona, you're exposed to a lot of the material on the Anasazi and the ancient ones, and who they were and what they built, and et cetera, et cetera. And it sure looks like that if the medicine men are correct, that the Anasazi, and I've seen some of their dwellings, their cliff dwellings, in the Four Corners area, especially up Mesa Verde and there along San Juan, and then also in what is now the flooded Lake Powell, which was Glen Canyon, and the area behind it. Lake Powell is 180 miles long. The Escalante Arm is 90 miles long, and the San Juan River arm is 90 miles long. That's a big lake. In the center, it's 700 feet deep. If they tried to build that today, they'd never get the environmental clearance to do it. It began during the Eisenhower administration, and the lake didn't fill until I think the early 80s. So it was a big lake. There are a tremendous number of cliff dwellings that were flooded by the lake, and the stories were about the folks that went in pot hunting for the pottery and different things as those began to fill, and the Park Service kind of turned a blind eye for a period of time because they knew it was going to be underwater. There are still some that you can step into today from your boat or climb up to, and they're strictly off limits now. And that was a lot of the talk. I sold houseboats on Lake Powell as kind of a side endeavor, worked with some folks that did. And we had offices in Denver and Phoenix. And spent a lot of time on the lake. Knew some folks that had been there prior to that. A fellow named Green, I believe it was Bill Green. He was a friend of mine. I knew an Art Green and a Bill Green. I think this was Bill Green. But he built the marina at Walweep at Page, Arizona. His family still run it today. He was a Navajo trader and had gone into most of that country on the back of a mule before they had finished the dam. And interesting stuff. The lake goes all the way up into Utah. And the Escalante arm, there have been a lot of weird sightings and different things of everything from mountain giants, red-headed guys that are over 20 foot tall and don't have tusks, but literally look like giant red-headed guys wearing a loincloth and moccasins, carrying a spear. There have been, this is way north of the Skinwalker area. And it's very bizarre. There's just you're over north of Navajo, north. I don't know whether it's east or west of Navajo Mountain. You're up in some of the weirder parts of Utah at that point. It's been a very interesting time being out there and seeing some of the legends from having them told you by some of the locals that have been there since the whole 50s. And as far as what's gone on in California and up the coast, it's been very interesting that you see these. You know, I hate to make the cross from giants to Bigfoot, but I think there's something in between. What Duke has talked about in the past about being mountain giants. And I personally believe that you're seeing pockets and remnants of things that nobody's got any explanations for, and the folks that have seen them have heard reports of servicemen in the Alaskan area, in part of Alaska that were, I guess, within 2 or 3 hour drive of the Air Force base up there, Fairbanks area, how they barely got out with their lives, they and their kids. These are guys that have their careers to think about, and they still made the reports that they had encountered things that they couldn't explain that were 18 to 20 foot tall and came after them, and they had tusks. There have been some sightings up there of some really strange things. And then we've also got Linda Moulton Howell, I believe is her name, is talked about, and I've heard it from another fella that the buried pyramid up there, that's somewhere in between Nome and Mount McKinley, Denali. There's some really strange, and how it's running, it's humming, and there's some really strange things that defy explanation that seem to suggest that there are remnants of cultures from the past that are still around today. It's been interesting to hear about L.A. Marzulli and his reporting with the shooter of the Kandahar giant. There's been folks in the military that have talked about there being more than just that one, and that there are still some around. Won't say anything more about that, but we live in a weird and wonderful world. Moving into Bigfoot, the subject of Bigfoot, and there's always been a link. You know, I have my background is Deliverance. I don't call myself an exorcist. Duke kind of likes to joke about it that way. We do Deliverance mostly with Christians, but I've done a lot with bikers and gangbangers that know where the bodies are buried. So it's been an interesting life. When we're dealing with these creatures, it seems to me that I have seen some things posted, some things that are on YouTube, but more than that, I've got a couple of friends that have had experiences. The one thing that's common denominator with the demonic, and seems to be a lot of the cryptids, is when I'm dealing with a deliverance that has, let's say the person's from a foreign country or has roots in a foreign country, and we're doing deliverance and the thing comes up and we begin to question it, it'll speak to me in a foreign language. And I'll immediately say, now give it to me in English, in Jesus' name. And it'll immediately start speaking English. It seems that the things of the spirit realm are not tied to the Tower of Babel and the splitting of the languages. The common denominator seems to be that when the tribes, I heard some folks on a show the other day that said that they were from multiple tribes and they had to get together and they went out where the Bigfoot are, and each one of them approached the Bigfoot in their own language, and they said, we're here, friendly, and we're not here to do you harm, et cetera, et cetera. And when they got done, the Bigfoot turned and walked away. And they accounted this as being the cumulative information and knowledge of their languages over hundreds or thousands of years that these things are born with. Well, to me, that seemed kind of a stretch. What seems more likely is that while I don't believe a lot of the cryptids have the ability to speak, I definitely believe they have the ability for cognitive thought. And it's been my humble opinion that they can understand just about any language. Now, I believe there's two types of every type of Bigfoot or cryptid. The ones that are inbred and kind of dumb, that seem to have a short temper. And then there are the ones that are more diversely genetic and seem to have some smarts. I also believe there's two kinds of alphas. Now, they may look alike, but I believe some of them are inbred, dumb, and mean. Those are the alphas that don't make it very long, and those are the ones that people seem to have an encounter with, that are antagonistic. But I also believe that there are those that are, in likewise manner, have, as the others, have a pretty much diverse gene pool and are pretty smart. I believe that those ones in particular, the smart ones in particular, they can tap into something that we would call paranormal. I certainly would, coming from my background, because I believe they can understand our language. I've heard multiple reports from multiple people, both online, on YouTube videos, and a couple in person. I can't overlook those. Where, and especially the one with Scott Carpenter, where he decided he was going to see whether or not these things understood him. And so he spoke disparagingly about the Bigfoot and how they were dumb and how they were bad and et cetera. And suddenly he and the fellow he was with got hit with some kind of a infrasound or something that hit him. He said he felt pain in his body. It was kind of like electricity going through him. The other fellow heard something but didn't feel that, but they both woke up the next day with blood in their urine. He's thoroughly convinced they understand English. I'm thoroughly convinced that they understand every language. You know, there's a time in history when supposedly there was a fellow working for the government that was from another world. And they all marveled because he could speak 100 languages. I believe he could speak every language. I think the common denominator of the things, and one of the tests that a person can apply is, are they able to speak and understand just about any language, or with the cryptids, understand any language? And in a pinch, they'll come out with verbiage in that language. Words crudely formed, but in that language. I remember one time a guy gave a report that we call them buggers, that the bugger had said, oh, he's got a gun. And he did have a gun. There have been other times when it seems like they've responded to what the people are saying. I also think that one of the common denominators is they feed off our fear and seem to get a kick out of it, especially the young ones. These are just things that when I've tried to figure these things out, I looked into. And it seems to me that we are dealing with something here that has, people like to use the word paranormal, and they seem to get a kick out of it. I don't get a kick out of it, but I do understand what that means. I think there's a spiritual connotation, and I personally believe that these things have within them some things that transcend time, distance, and are they supernatural? I think they're flesh and blood. Of course, I think that if you listen to what if you read what Peter said, he said that these original angels had given up their first estate, and they're locked in human bodies. Now, do those same things have supernatural abilities? I would believe they do. What really interested me when I made the connection and looked into this stuff was the story of Enoch and how these Nephilim were not going to be candidates for heaven, that salvation was not available to them, and that neither were they going to have standing in hell. That's been one of the questions that a lot of us have delved into in deliverance ministry and that have worked around spiritual warfare is, where do these things come from? Some of us have even seen things in the Spirit that the Holy Spirit has revealed to us, and we don't think these things were ever in heaven. So from the book of Enoch, we hear that the judgment on the giants was that they be vagabonds, disenfranchised spirits, that they would roam the earth till the day of final judgment. And then we look at Jesus when he crossed the Sea of Galilee and encountered the demoniac of Gennesaret. And we see that the man living among the tombs, actually some of the early translations say there were two men, that they were living among the tombs and were cutting themselves and basically tore their clothes and were in bad shape. And when Jesus showed up, they charged him. And he had to yell at them multiple times to stop, to get them arrested in their forward movement toward him. And he asked them, "Who are you?" And they said, "We are legion, for we are many." And then they said the most interesting thing. Once I saw the book of Enoch, this all clicked. They said, "Have you come? We know who you are, O Holy One of Israel," or Holy One of God. "Have you come to torment us before our appointed time?" So they knew there was an appointed time, and this just bears witness with the book of Enoch, that they have an appointed time, i.e., or meaning the great white throne judgment, but prior to that, they're vagabonds and allowed to wander the earth. Of course, they're looking for a house because they like to eat and drink and be merry. And we always say they're a bad personality looking for a body to inhabit. Or a house to inhabit, a body. So if these things knew they had an appointed time, found that curious. It seemed to me to make the connection that this is where the demonic had come from. And that these things are the disenfranchised spirits of the Nephilim, the giants, and all of these. There must have, with as many of them as we believe there are, and there's a lot of them, we believe there must have, at one time, from the giants, either pre-Genesis 1 or pre-Genesis 6, the Noah's flood, there must have been a bunch of them. Because, and those of us who have dealt with them don't believe they were ever in heaven. Now, when we're dealing with deliverance issues, we usually will come across a strong man, and then his house is usually these things. And the strong man is usually what we call a seraphim, a wingless angel. And they'll be the strong man of one thing or another, but they'll have a house. And Jesus talked about how can you can't go into a man's house and plunder his goods unless you first tie him up. So likewise, you must bind the strong man before you can plunder his house. So he's talking about this same kind of infrastructure when you're dealing with deliverance issues. And we know from experience this has been so. And so it's an interesting connection. I'm not here to preach, but it's an interesting connection between the two. I'm just speaking anecdotally here. It's interesting to see the similarities and why these things seem to act the way they are and can understand all the languages, and then moving that to the cryptids. Why, especially the dog man and some of the others, they seem to deal in fear and get turned on by terrorizing. So is there a connection between all these critters? Well, it's interesting to think about. There's so many different kinds of what we call dogmen and so many different kinds of what we call Sasquatch. I even saw one on TV one time, and it seemed like actual footage. The thing had a head like a sheep, like a ram. So, they called it sheep squatch. It's something that's known in Kentucky. So I just find it highly suspicious that that folks can go out into the woods and encounter these things and speak in their native tongue and be understood. Now, the Native Americans that had done that, one was from the Pacific Northwest and the other two were from Nebraska. Their languages are not anywhere similar, and the thing seemed to understand them all, and they certainly thought that it did. And when they were done, it walked away. I've got other anecdotal stories, but I don't really want to go into them right now. This is a phenomena that we see that's, again, really tied to the things of the spiritual, the negative, the spiritual darkness. And if that's the case, then where do these things go, and what are they, upon their demise, where do they end up? And it sure seems to me like if they're not candidates for salvation, it seems to me like that these things may very well end up in the same spot that the giants did, as disenfranchised spirits. So this is, it's given me, I decided to look into Bigfoot to see what they were and try to see it from a biblical perspective. And the more I've looked, the more I'm convinced that these things are Nephilim in their origins, Raphaim in their genealogy, and that they do have a supernatural component. Are they flesh and blood? Yes. Are they aliens? Do they work with the aliens and all the other crazy stuff? I don't know. I do know that there's been a couple of people that were abducted that later became Christians, and they told their stories, and one of them was convinced that he saw a Bigfoot-like creature during his abduction on the ship. I've heard some other folks say that they've got photos of, which I've not seen, they've got photos of little grays sitting on the shoulders of these things, especially the dogmen. It seems to me like it's the old battle of light and darkness, and my Bible says perfect love casteth out fear, and fear seems to be the weapon of first resort with these things, and seems to be the thing that they delight in causing us. There's some good, there's some that have done good for people, some that have helped them. I know that Bob Garrett tells a pretty good story about one that saved him. There's been some other folks that have had similar stories. So there is some humanity been displayed. But again, you know, when Duke and I first talked about doing this show, we wanted to talk about whether or not these things could be possessed, and whether or not there's reason to be concerned in that regard, and I believe they can. I believe they're empty vessels, and I believe that they most certainly can have these entities that are looking for, that have at one time enjoyed life, enjoyed eating, enjoyed drinking, enjoyed sex, and it seems to me like that there are a lot of them that could sure find a home in these things, and it doesn't seem like there's much that would stand in their way. So we've got types and varieties like the Geological, which are the Bigfoot that do eat people, and the Googways, the Wendigos, etc. It seems to me like that these ones that seem to have the disposition of a porcupine with hemorrhoids and certainly enjoy chasing people around and attacking people and eating people. You know, there's a reason the Choctaw and a couple of other tribes called the Googways face eaters, because they eat your face. It's, you know, some of this stuff is meant to be taken literally. They'll take your head and eat it. It's an odd and peculiar world we live in. This is certainly different than what I'd been taught in school. There's a time and a place to talk about some of this stuff. I'm having a hard time not going where I probably shouldn't go. So I don't know if we're going to finish this and whether Duke's going to edit it out. But at this point, I think I'm probably going to close this show and let Duke edit it the way he wants to. I appreciate your time, your consideration, and I pray that God blesses you, every one of you, with the desires of your heart. Thank you so much. Good night.